start the recording now. I want to welcome everybody and thank you for being here tonight. I have not met everybody. I have met most of everybody, but if we have not met, I'm Dan Lomar. I'm the newly elected safety officer of the Flying 20, also the maintenance officer on 448. And so if we haven't met before and you see me around, introduce yourself. That's what I've been trying to do with everybody as time goes by. It takes a while to meet everybody in the club, that's for sure. But anyway, as a safety officer and as a member of the club, I look at this just like any other club. Hey, we're here to help each other out. And so if we can get together every once in a while, share ideas, share thoughts, share lessons learned from each other, I think that's a great thing to do. And I don't care if you got 10 hours or 10,000 hours, we all have something to offer each other. Whether it's a student pilot who doesn't understand the way I'm explaining something to maybe something I can bring in as an airline pilot, and then also bringing in outside people like we are tonight. So that's kind of what we're here for tonight. And then also, I would love to do something like this once a month. So I've already got some ideas for like next month, just having a short 30 or 40 minute call. I've talked to the guy who's the jump pilot down at Taylorville. So maybe get his perspective on how they run jump operations and how we can deconflict for those guys. So that's just another idea. That's kind of what we're here. Those are just kind of some of my thoughts on this stuff. But as I said, too, bring in outside members. That's what we're doing tonight. So let me talk about, introduce our guest speaker tonight is no other than my first flight instructor, who also happens to be my oldest brother, John Lomar. John has been flying for more than 50 years. He's literally been flying longer than I've been alive. Okay. I mean, that's the truth. So he started taking his first flying lesson when he was 12. I was not born yet. So anyway, he's got a lot of experience to offer us. This spring he'll be awarded the Wright Brothers Master Pilot Award. He's retired captain from American Airlines, where he worked a good part of his career in the training center. He has a master's degree in aviation safety from Parks College, which is both of our alma mater for both of us. And he's also the 2017 and 2018 T6 National Air Race champion. But what I like about John, not only has he taught me a lot of great lessons and been a great example for me, but with all his credentials, which kind of leads into our talk tonight, he'll be the first one to tell you that he's just as vulnerable to making the mistakes and the errors that lead up to accidents and incidents, because we're all human beings, and that's really what it comes down to. So with that, I will hand it off to John, and he can take it from there.
Great. Thank you, Dano. So first of all, I want to say I'm really glad to be here and help with this. Something that's near and dear to my heart is general aviation safety, aviation safety in general, but certainly as it applies to general aviation. So, and a couple ground rules. First of all, I've given this presentation to a lot of public groups, public forums, National Warbird Operators Conference 3 times, the Test Pilot School at Edwards Air Force Base, Ageless Aviation Dreams Foundation, and a couple other different organizations. And when I know from experience, like Dan said, I've made my career in flying. I know from experience that when you put a slide up on the wall that says safety briefing, everybody gets a strong urge to take a nap. Because safety briefings are usually just painful, right? So it's usually a bunch of boring statistics, rules and regulations, do's and don'ts, review of policy and procedure. And at the end of the day, while some of that might be interesting, you go, what do I do differently tomorrow than what I did today? That seems to be the missing piece. So here's the deal. If you'll give me your attention for the next 30 minutes or so, because quite frankly, safety and safety briefings like that is the most important thing we can do in aviation. What I'll do in return is I'll try to keep it short. Like Dano said, I've cut this hour-long or so presentation down to about 30 minutes. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Feel free to take notes. So I won't bore you with a lot of boring statistics and stuff like that. And at the end of the day, at the end of the presentation, I'll actually give you something that you can take away. So learning will have occurred, because those of you who are flight instructors may remember how the FAA defines learning. You remember that? Learning is a change in behavior, a change in behavior as a result of experience. All right, so hopefully tonight learning will have occurred. This young man right here is fixing to have a learning experience, right? He's probably been told a million times by his mother not to play with the outlet, but it didn't do any good. He's going to have a learning experience. My guess is his behavior tomorrow will be different than it was today. So hopefully at the end of this, we've all learned something. So Dan gave a little bit about my background, but my interest in how I kind of came to this is through, not through just general aviation, but warbird flight operations. And what, a lot of things got me interested in warbirds. I grew up in the 60s, and our dad and our Uncle Bob were both veterans of World War II. All my friends' dads were veterans of World War II, so it was just kind of natural to be interested in World War II, and I got interested in aviation. And the thing that struck me about the great privilege that I have to be able to go around to air shows and demonstrate these airplanes and talk about the great sacrifices that men and women both of that generation gave, to defeat Nazism and Japanese imperialism. But one of the things that struck me is, in addition to that great sacrifice and how the whole country pulled together and won that war, was the huge change in technology, and we get to showcase that. So, just a quick introduction to that. 1938, when the war was getting started good in Europe, the United States still had a very strict interventionist policy, non-interventionist policy, I should say. Our frontline fighters were these. They were open cockpit, cloth-covered biplanes. Our frontline bombers were open cockpit, twin-engine airplanes. The bombardier literally sat up front right here, looked over, went, well, that looks good, and dropped the bomb. And that was the height of technology in 1938 in United States Army Air Corps. 7 years later, 1945, the end of the war, 7 years later, we're flying 4-engine, pressurized, transcontinental range bombers at altitudes we fly jetliners at today, and dropping nuclear weapons. We did that in 7 years. And, I have the honor and the privilege of going around and telling those stories and showcasing that technology. And it's been a great honor, and I've got to fly some really cool airplanes, and I've got to do some really cool things. It's not very often you look off your right wing and there's a Corsair parked out there. But with that right, or that privilege, of course, always comes an equal and opposite responsibility, right? And so I have some safety education experience, as Dano pointed out, and I have an interest in that. And so I began to feel maybe a little bit obligated to do something along those lines, because quite frankly, people get dead doing this. These are some statistics I collect on warbird fatalities, but I read the 2019, which is the latest null report. If you've ever read that, it's online, it's free, AOPA. I think it's probably on the NTSB website too. Has all the breakdown of all the statistics for accidents and incidents for the previous year. But anyway, the general aviation accidents fall along very similar lines to this. So you can see that we've actually got warbird fatality statistics going back into the 1990s, good 25 years worth. They're pretty steady. Every year, they're up or down a little bit. Usually the reason they're down is because we're not flying as much. This is where 2008, 2009, the economy went down. This is where gas went up. Over here, 2020 is not in here yet, but I'm sure it's low because of COVID. But other than those kind of unnatural shocks, the accident rate is pretty steady. Something in the neighborhood of 8 to 10 times a year, warbird pilots kill themselves. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. I started looking into it, and guess what? We keep killing ourselves for the same reason. We're a pretty consistent bunch, but we're not very creative. Loss of control in flight, controlled flight into terrain, controlled flight into terrain, controlled flight into terrain, loss of control in flight, loss of control in flight, controlled flight into terrain, loss of control, loss of control, loss of control, loss of control. So guess what? The null report showed almost exactly the same thing for general aviation. What causes this in the warbird community? Guys doing low-level acro, or they fly VFR into IMC conditions, and then that's followed by loss of control or controlled flight into terrain. On the null report, just general aviation, low-level acro is less of a player, but there's other reasons for loss of control. Proficiency is an issue, distractions in the cockpit. But the two players in general aviation are loss of control and VFR flight into IMC weather that then results in loss of control or controlled flight into terrain. So the thing that really motivated me though, as I got interested in this, is not only that, I felt a sort of a sense of obligation to the industry to give back something, but in addition to that, I have friends that are buried in these statistics. I've had the experience of standing at Air Show Center and watch some of these accidents occur. And so, I got motivated. Why are we killing ourselves? Why are we letting our friends die when the solution to this is so simple? And a perfect example was a terrible accident, really devastated me in summer of 2017. Vlado Lennox, you may have heard of him. He was very, very well-known warbird pilot around Illinois. Lived in the Chicago area, flew out of, I think, DuPage. I flew with Vlado over the years, dozens of times at air shows around Illinois, Missouri, and Indiana, Wisconsin. He was a very well thought of warbird pilot. He was doing an air show in Kansas, and he took Bethany Root up for a ride. Bethany was a member of our race team for 2 years. Just coincidence that she happened to be the manager at the airport he was putting the air show on at, and after the show, decided to take her up for a ride. That's Vlado's airplane there, taxiing out behind me. We're going to do some formation flying together at a little flying that we're at. So Vlado takes Bethany for a ride and becomes one of these statistics. Low-level aerobatics, controlled flight into terrain. They've hit the ground with plenty of flying speed, the engine working, the propeller turning, and the airplane going a million miles an hour, under control. So the goal here is what? Is to get the accident rate down to zero, right? Not just reduce it, get it down to zero. And I guess the point I'm trying to make with what I was saying about the reasons for these accidents can really best be summed up in this quote. This is a quote that I found while I was doing research. I think actually on my master's degree, it might have been when I was doing research for this presentation. So the history of past investigations demonstrates greater prudence is needed rather than greater skill. Well, that's true. Have any idea who said that and when? (1901). So we've known this for a long time. We tend in our industry to focus on proficiency. Everybody wants to take a check ride. Everybody wants to do good on the maneuvers. Everybody wants to do well on the procedures. And that's great. I mean, pilot proficiency is kind of a given. But what I found from doing research into these fatal warbird accidents, and 90% certain that it follows right into general aviation as a whole, is that the proficiency related accidents are typically embarrassing accidents. Hard landings, off runway excursions, short landings, long landings, that kind of thing. The fatal accidents are almost inevitably decision making. And so what typically happens is we hear about an accident, and we go, oh my gosh, and you read through the accident report, or you learned about, you read through the story about it, or you hear about it. And when you hear how it happened, you typically go something like this, right? Why couldn't he or she see that coming? Or what in the world was he thinking? What were they thinking? So, well, what I have to ask you then is, have you ever stepped down out of your airplane and said, that was stupid. I don't think I'll ever do that again. Any of you ever had that experience? I certainly have, and I'm not afraid to admit to you that I have. I'm probably a little embarrassed to tell you how recently that was, but that's a different subject. So if that's happened to you, then you've got to ask yourself, well, what were you thinking, and why didn't you see that risk? Why didn't you see the risk was associated with whatever it was that you just did? Well, there's actually very good reason for it. First of all, our perception of risk is skewed by chemical processes in the brain and by what behavioral psychologists call cognitive biases, which they've identified about 170 of them. So, we're not going to talk but about a few of them here tonight. So first of all, just a real quick overview. These are some of the chemicals you've got going on in your brain here that relate to this. Dopamine and endorphins are both externally precipitated. So in other words, an external event happens and you get a hit of dopamine or a hit of endorphins. Intrinsically, serotonin and oxytocin, these are things that calm people down. These are things that motivate people and reduce the effects of pain and stuff like that. So this is what makes people goal-oriented, right? In the days when the goal was to find food and you saw game out across the plain, you got a little dopamine hit. And as you got closer to it and you saw yourself approaching it, you got more dopamine and more dopamine. And then, running across the savannah of Africa doesn't feel good. Endorphins help reduce the pain and keep the motivation going. Back home in the village, you got attaboys, that's where these came in. But the point of this is what precipitates chemically VFR flight into IFR weather. Because once we've set a goal, we get a dopamine hit knowing that we're attaining it. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about risk and specifically cognitive biases. So here's an example of how we skew our perception of things. In a typical day in the United States, about 7,000 people die, all causes. About half of them from heart disease and cancer, about 330 something from accidents, most of which are automobile accidents, 105 by suicide, 80 from gunshot wounds, 2/3 of which are self-inflicted either purposely or accidentally. The calculation of the risk from dying from these things is much greater than the risk of things like a bee sting, lightning strike, or shark bite. Yet these are things that we tend to focus on. So given that knowledge, how many people look at that and decide, gee, I should increase my exercise. I should cut down on the junk food I'm eating. I should make sure I'm not texting or talking while I'm driving. Quit smoking. Handle firearms safely. Get help for depression. We don't do that. We're not motivated to do that because the novelty of low probability events, again, gives us a chemical stimulation. It's like watching a horror movie. The other causes of death, cancer, heart disease, so what? They're familiar. We all know somebody that's died of those things, and that makes them boring. Excuse me. So what we find out is the human brain is divided into a number of different parts. I'm sorry, that's the pilot brain. There's the human brain. And this part right here is called the cerebral cortex, which is the higher order part of our brain. It's the part of our brain that provides for the higher order human emotions. And this is the residency for our ability to speak, write, do music, mathematics, relate to each other, predict the future, and all those things that we consider to be human abilities. But buried way down deep inside the brain is a leftover from our reptilian brain called the amygdala. It's two little walnut-shaped pieces of actually brain matter that are deep down in the bottom of the brain stem there. And the amygdala is the home for our most basic emotions. Of course, fear being the most basic. And it's the source of the fight, flight, or freeze response. You may have heard of the fight or flight response. There's actually three. Given a high risk, sudden onset risk, you're going to either fight or flight or run or freeze. And you don't have any choice which one you're going to do. Your brain is going to automatically pick one and you're just going to do it. So we'll talk a little bit about risk perceptions. And I originally called this presentations, Will My Friends Think I'm an Idiot? And the idea being is when you step down out of your airplane and go, boy, that was stupid. I won't do that again. Well, maybe before you get to that point, you could ask yourself, gee, even if I get away with this, are my friends going to think I'm an idiot? Because embarrassment actually is a good human emotion for, observing risk. So let's talk a little bit about what risk is. And I know what you're thinking. Go for it, kid, right? We tend to be a risk-averse lot as pilots. So risk is fun. There's actually a reason that we as human beings are skewed to take risk. In the days when you had to hunt for food and find shelter and stave off enemies, predators, taking a certain amount of risk is what allowed human beings to progress. Secondly, it's ubiquitous. We can't get away from it. So what that means is what? We continuously perceive and mitigate risk all day, every day. You do it subconsciously. And we'll talk a little bit about that process here in just a minute. Risk is completely personal. So something that's risky to me might not be risky at all to you. You might be very conservative with your finances, yet think flying low-level aerobatics is perfectly acceptable, and I'm the other way around. So the point is, we all have a personal set point for risk tolerance. All right, formal definition of risk is what? It's what we use in the airline industry, the military, and stuff like that. Those of us that get to, kind of work with this professionally, is the likelihood of something bad happening multiplied or factored by the severity of the consequences equals total risk. So we have tools that we use to look at those kind of things, like this matrix here. You can see along this side, you've got the likelihood of something happening from almost never to almost certain. And then over here, the consequences if it does happen. So basically insignificant to catastrophic. So where's the rubber meet the road here? Well, obviously the red part is easy. We stay out of that. The green part's pretty easily. These are things that we can accept without too much trouble. The rubber meets the road here in the yellow, where we decide whatever this is worth doing, but we know it's a high enough risk that we have to mitigate it somehow. So we go through this formal process. A risk is perceived, it's analyzed using that matrix or something like that. We decide to do it. If we don't, we're done. We either decide to do it or it's a risk that just is suddenly onsets on us and you have no choice but to accept that you're going to have to deal with this risk. So what do we do then? We devise a mitigation strategy. We implement the mitigation strategy. We collect data. Those data are fed back into a very sophisticated computer processor designed specifically for storing and analyzing these types of data. That data is fed back into the mitigation strategy. A new mitigation strategy is implemented, new data is collected, and you've got a continuous feedback loop here going that allows you to continually analyze your mitigation strategy and implement new ones as you get more data. Well, those of us in the safety business would love to think that we came up with this on our own, but the fact of the matter is it's exactly how human beings have been mitigating risk for millions of years. Here's one of our old predecessors out walking across the plains of East Africa one day and sees something move in the bushes up ahead. So a risk is perceived, it's analyzed. Is this acceptable or not? Or do I have to deal with it? Well, it turns out, yes, it is. I do have to deal with it. So I'm going to devise a mitigation strategy, implement it, and collect data, right? Is this cat gaining on me? Should I turn left? Should I turn right? Should I climb a tree? Really don't have to outrun the cat. You only have to outrun the other caveman, right? Those data are then collected and fed back into a very sophisticated computer processor designed specifically for collecting and implementing these types of data called the human brain. That goes back into the mitigation strategy, a new mitigation strategy is implemented, data collected, so on and so forth, feedback loop. So this is the way pilots have been doing risk mitigation for millions of years. Interfering with that are these cognitive biases that I talked about a little bit ago, and how they color our world. So I'm going to give you just a couple of quick examples. And again, I apologize, I'm kind of running through this and not fleshing these things out very much because of the limited time we have this evening, but I'm happy to answer questions about this and explore it more with anybody that wants to. So quick question, quiz time here. How many people on this presentation think that you are an above average pilot? Raise your hand, I can see you all. So what happens is virtually everybody raises their hand, right? So if we have, you know, in a typical presentation, I might have 150 people in the room, and what I tell them is, well, 130 of you just raised your hand. That means there's another 130 pilots out there that think they're less than average pilots, right? Well, the answer is, of course, we all think we're above average pilots. And there's actually a reason for that. The bias is called overconfidence bias, and it's a result, again, of human evolution. We actually do things better if we think we are better. And we really do believe that subconsciously. It's not just some kind of feel-good, positive thinking pablum. So again, when the task at hand was finding food, finding shelter, staving off predators, it was actually to your advantage to be a little overconfident. In fact, 20% of us believe we're in the top 1% income group. Another 20% believe that they'll soon be there. 93% of us believe that we're above average drivers. Half of us believe we participate in more healthy behaviors than others and fewer unhealthy behaviors than others. 75% of college students believe that they're above average in academic ability. And of course, all of us think that our children or grandchildren, as is applicable, are the smartest and cutest kids in the world. You're wrong, mine are. We have another bias, blind spot bias, which means, yes, we have a blind spot to our blind spots. It's hard to even realize that we're not seeing things. We have a bias called availability bias. And basically that is, it's based on experience. If you have a limited amount of experience and you suddenly are in a situation where you have to make decisions, you're going to make decisions based on that limited experience that you have in your toolbox. So the more experience you have, the better you'll be able to analyze and come up with a mitigation strategy and implement the strategy. Anchoring bias, we're influenced by information that's known but irrelevant. I heard a study once that, or read a study once where they sat a group of 100 people in a room, divided them into 50 and 50, and they put a slide on the wall that said the average temperature in San Francisco in June is 450 degrees. And then asked them to write down what they thought the average temperature was in June in San Francisco. The other half of the room, they put a slide on the wall that said the average temperature in June in San Francisco was minus 30 degrees. And then asked them to put down what they thought the average temperature was in June in San Francisco. Well, guess what? The temperature that the group that had been influenced or had been shown the high, ridiculously high temperature, was totally irrelevant, guessed 10 to 15 degrees higher than the true answer, and the group that had been shown the low number guessed 10 to 15 degrees lower than the true number. They were biased by totally irrelevant information. All right, inattentional blindness, this is what we in the business call tunnel vision, right? When we're focused on something, everything else gets excluded, right? And change blindness. We are not good at perceiving slow changes. So if something changes in our visual field very, very slowly, we won't see it. So I'm going to skip over this test, but I had a video here that's a demonstration of those two things. It shows you how hard it is to perceive something that changes slowly. Here's another one that's a big deal in aviation, particularly in the airline industry. Years ago, I was working for one of the airlines I worked for, and I was doing some safety work, and we noticed that we had a lot of ground damaged airplanes from baggage carts and tugs and stuff like that. And that's not truly a safety issue, but it's a precursor. So we started looking into it, and people were just parking the equipment too close to the airplanes. So we told them, hey, look, you got to back this stuff up at least 10 feet from the airplane, which they did. We put out a bunch of policies and called all the different stations and trained the agents and all that. And guess what? Our baggage, our ground damage to airplanes went down significantly. But about a year later, it ticked back up. And a year after that, it had ticked back up. In fact, it had gone back to about where it was. And the reason was what? Originally, people moved everything back 10 feet from the airplane. But then one day, Joe parked his tug 9 feet from the airplane. You know, that became the new normal. So did somebody else. Then somebody else parked at 7 feet from the airplane. That became the new normal. So that's what we mean by normalization of deviance. Pretty soon, everything was just back to where it was 2 years prior. How did we solve that problem? Painted lines on the ground around the airplanes. Now a person had to make a conscious decision to park on the other side of the line, as opposed to a subconscious one. All right, this is an interesting quote that I found. Why give up on a belief just because it's not true any longer? Because that reminds me of two of the most important, I think I should say most significant cognitive biases that relate directly to aviation. Confirmation bias and expectation bias. The sunk cost fallacy or irrational escalation has to do, again, with VFR flight into IFR weather, right? We tend to throw good money after bad is the old phrase. Well, when you're halfway to your destination, even though the weather's going down and it's weather you would have never taken off into, your brain tends to go, well, yeah, but I'm already halfway there. I'm already 2/3 of the way there. It's just a little bit further. And you'll press on into weather that you wouldn't have taken off into. But the confirmation bias and the expectation bias are very important to us in aviation. I'm sure some of you looking at the screen are old enough to remember the Challenger accident in 1986. Roger Boisjoli was an engineer that worked for Morton Thiokol, and he was in his boss's office the day before the launch saying, don't launch this vehicle. We have data that shows that those O-ring seals will fail at these temperatures. We already had a partial failure on a flight a year or so earlier where the temperature was cold, but not as cold as it was. And we absolutely should not launch. And his boss basically said it's going to be okay. So he went above his boss directly to NASA officials. And they basically showed him the door too. And of course, we know what happened. You know, he told him that he didn't think the vehicle would get off the launch pad. It would explode on the launch pad. And he was wrong. You know, got into the air for about 1:13 seconds. And the reason is because there was a lot of political things going on with funding for NASA and whatnot, and everybody was under a lot of pressure to make sure this launch went on time. It had already been delayed several times, and so there was a lot of confirmation bias here where people were only able to hear information that confirmed what they already believed to be true, which is that the vehicle was ready to launch. Another kind of an example of confirmation bias, but also expectation bias was this is the worst disaster in aviation history. In the Tenerife, where the two 747s ran together in 1977. I was a very new professional pilot, chief pilot for a little charter company in St. Louis. I remember when this accident occurred. I'll give you the long story short here, but these airplanes had to divert because of a bomb threat in the terminal in, I think they're going to Madrid, I forget now, somewhere in Spain. And they had to divert to this little airport on the Tenerife Island. And it was foggy. So they landed, they both taxied in, they got fuel, but they had to park on a taxiway instead of the main ramp because there wasn't room for two 747s and some other airplanes that had to divert on the ramp. So the bottom line is they get fueled up and they're ready to taxi out. Now KLM is cleared to taxi down the runway and turn around into position and hold. Pan Am is cleared to taxi behind him and then clear the runway 2/3 of the way down to the taxiway and hold short of the runway. Well, as they're taxiing out, the KLM airplane gets an ATC clearance, not a clearance to take off, but an ATC clearance, which the first officer copies down and reads back. The pilot, the captain of the KLM airplane, was expecting to get cleared for takeoff when he turned the airplane into position. And when he heard that ATC clearance, he heard what he expected to hear, which was cleared for takeoff. He pushed the throttles up and said, we're going. And the engineer, second officer on the flight, said, I don't think we're cleared for takeoff. And he said, oh, yes, we are. I'm paraphrasing because it was all said in Dutch, of course, which is another factor going into all of this, right? You had KLM pilots whose native language was Dutch, and Spanish pilots, Spanish air traffic controllers, and they're all speaking English. But anyway, the first officer didn't say anything. The engineer again expressed doubt. The captain said, no, we're going, and away they went. And, a few seconds later, here's this 747 in the fog. The Pan Am pilot tried to turn the airplane off the runway, and so it kind of hit the airplane, his airplane, center to aft part of the fuselage. 583 people died. Worst disaster in aviation history. And it was nothing more than expectation bias and confirmation bias. I shouldn't say it was nothing more, because there were, like I said, language factors. Fatigue was a factor. The crews had been up all night. But the primary drivers here were expectation bias and confirmation bias. All right, another example of a bias. How many people died on 9/11? The commonly accepted number here, 2,977, were either died in New York City or in Shanksville, Pennsylvania on the day of the attack or within a few days of the attack as a direct result of injuries they received during the attack. So round numbers 3,000, right? Well, guess what? Between October and December of 2001, there were 344 driving fatalities per month. 2001 to 2002, the highway deaths in the United States were equal to a 9/11 attack every 26 days, less than a month. In between September of 2001 and September of 2002, there were an additional 2,170 highway deaths over what would have been expected during that same time period. So you have 2,170 additional highway deaths, 2,977 deaths that were direct result of the attacks. That means the bad guys got a 73% boost in dead Americans, simply because of this cognitive bias. The airlines were no more dangerous on 9/12 than they were on 9/10, and driving on a highway was no safer on 9/12 than it was on 9/10, but the perception had changed, and the bad guys got a 73% boost. It's a result of the way we perceive low probability, high damage disasters. The emotion associated with that skews our risk analysis, and we overestimate the odds of dreadful but infrequent events and underestimate how risky ordinary things are. Okay, stress is not really a cognitive bias, but it plays into this a little bit. This is from a couple of studies I read, actually, that were around real high stress or high risk environments. Soldiers in combat, police officers in gun battles, that type of thing. And what they find out is when you are presented with a high risk event, initially what happens? You get a hit of adrenaline, right? And that's good, because that little hit of adrenaline, you get it first, does a lot of good things for you. It bumps your heart rate up to between 115 and 145 beats per minute. Your vision becomes more acute, your hearing becomes more acute, your fine motor skills improve. The problem is, if you get up over 145 beats per minute, as the threat becomes more and more real and more intense, this is a quote out of one of the studies, bad things start to happen. And by 175 beats per minute, there's a, quote, absolute breakdown of cognitive processing. So what you want to try and do is keep your heart rate in this 145 or so beats per minute area or under. And that's actually true for all people. These were not trained athletes or anything like that. It's been proven to work for basically people of all ages and fitness levels. Framing effect. Okay, our perception of data is affected by how the data are presented and by whom. I can give you a couple different stories on how this works, but here's one real quick one. You go into a store and you see bananas. They're 25 cents a piece. How many would you buy? I'd buy a couple, right? I like bananas. How many would you buy if they were 4 for $1? Most people would buy 4. Okay? That's the framing effect. The bananas are no more valuable than they were before, but if you frame it 4 for $1, most people will buy 4. In fact, the studies have shown a 37% increase in sales by quantifying something as 4 for $1 as opposed to 25 cents a piece. And another 10% in sales, limit 4. All right. Police reports indicate that drivers of what kind of vehicles are most likely to lose control when the roads are bad? 4-wheel drive. We have, remember I said earlier, we have a personal risk tolerance level that we're comfortable with. If we get away from that level that we're most comfortable with, we will tend to work back to it, even if that means that we're doing something that's more dangerous. If we get above it, we'll tend to do something that's less dangerous to get us back to our comfort zone, but we can actually get below it and do things that are more dangerous to get back into that risk tolerance level that we're comfortable with. And that's why I say people take their seatbelts off, they'll drive slower. They put their seatbelts on, they drive faster. They have a 4-wheel drive vehicle, they'll drive faster than they do in a 2-wheel drive vehicle. All right, so I promised you at the beginning that I would give you something that you can use to take some of this away and be safer tomorrow than what you were today. So I came up with what I call Lomar's top 10 tips to keep you alive. So number 1, or number 10, I should say, admit that you have a bias blind spot. So you ask yourself, is there something here that I'm not seeing or not hearing? Enhance your experience. So put more tools in your toolbox. So this is an excuse to, go out and get a new rating, work on your instrument rating, get a multi-engine rating, check out in a complex aircraft, and do anything you can do to enhance your experience in aviation. And remember, there's 3 aspects to experience, right? There's breadth of experience, there's depth of experience, and there's recency of experience. You need all 3. All right, ask yourself, am I just moving back to my comfortable risk tolerance level? In other words, am I risk compensation? Am I simply moving back to my comfort zone? Inattentional blindness. Is there a gorilla in the room here that I'm not seeing because I'm focusing on something else? All right, set hard boundaries. Draw a line on the ground, not physically necessarily, but metaphorically. I can't tell you how to fly your airplane, but I set personal limits for my airplane, and I view them as hard boundaries. I won't violate them. So I won't fly my T6 if I have over a 15-knot crosswind. I love to do aerobatics in my T6. I don't do them all that well, so I know better than to do them close to the ground, right? So I go up to about 5,000, 6,000 feet, and I use 4,000 feet as a hard deck. If I get to 4,000 feet, I quit, climb back up and get some more altitude. All right, take a deep breath. Studies have shown if you do nothing more than take 2 deep, slow breaths in through your nose, out through your mouth, you can reduce your heart rate 20 to 30 beats a minute and get back into the optimum state of arousal as opposed to the panic state. All right, ask yourself if I'm making a larger investment in an already bad decision, like flying VFR into IFR weather. Am I asking the wrong questions or hearing the wrong answers? This, like I said, is probably the most important thing in aviation, the confirmation bias and expectation bias. Am I hearing what's really true, or am I hearing what I expect to hear or what I want to hear? All right, this is a big one. In groups, don't be afraid to speak up. Be the guy that breaks the seal here and gives a different perspective to the group. Remember that I told you the story about the KLM accident? Who had the keys to preventing that accident there? And like most accidents, it was an error chain, right? It was the old Dr. Reason's Swiss cheese model, all the holes lined up, but somebody had the keys really to break that error chain. It was the first officer, right? because the captain was adamant they were cleared to go. The engineer was pretty sure we weren't cleared to go. The first officer didn't say anything. Had he said, yeah, you know, I don't think we're cleared to go, the captain may have acquiesced. Last of all, just ask yourself, you know, even if I get away with this, well, my friends think I'm an idiot, because embarrassment actually is a very good human motivator. All right, so I've got these in Word format. I'll send it to Dan. He can send it out to the rest of you as you wish. I actually have them formatted such that in one of the versions of it, you can cut it in half and paste the two sides back to back and take it down to Kinko's and get it laminated, and it'll fit in a flight suit pocket. So did that for the Warbird guys. The goal in any case here is what? Get the Warbird, in this case, general aviation accidents down to 0. Before I end, I'm going to give you some homework. These are 2 books that I read a long time ago, 20 years ago. Tony Kern, he's a great author. If any of you have ever heard of him, he was an Air Force B-1 pilot back in the 90s. While he was working for the Air Force as a pilot, he got a PhD in behavioral psychology and began studying, at that time, Air Force accidents primarily. And he ended up writing a half a dozen books. But these are 2 of my favorites, and they are directly related to what we're talking about here tonight: risk perception and mitigation. And last but not least, shameless promotion. There are a lot of really good aviation organizations out there, and if you don't have the EAA card and an AOPA card in your wallet or purse, you should. And my personal favorite too is the Commemorative Air Force. All right, that's it. Oh, one more shameless promotion. Here we go. If you've never been to the Reno Air Races, you should go. Tell everybody in aviation, if you have any interest in aviation, you owe it yourself to go to Oshkosh at least once and go to the Reno Air Races at least once.